Hearing the career highlights of the last two speakers made me wonder why they couldn't hold down a job. This is by way of a think piece, really. I mean, I think we've had some, fantastic kind of stories and information there from Mick and Keith, and I just want to sort of change the frame a little bit. And I suppose my starting position was, how many reports will it take before something gets done about it? The Gerald de Ladain's report in Canada was 1973, recommended legalising cannabis. Justin Trudeau's acting on that report 45 years later. Peter Boehm's Royal Senate Commission was in 1975, the Sackville report. A witty report, I don't know if you've read it recently, but Earl Sackville and what was his name? Anyway, it doesn't matter. The three of them. It was a very witty report from South Australia in 1977, recommended all these things. How many reports is it going to take? And in a way I feel sad. I see Mick's report for Australia 21 and other reports that I've seen around the place, and I think so many trees dying over something which is kind of mind-bogglingly obvious, and it's a waste of human resources. It's a waste of our social capital and mental capital. We're still talking about this thing. So that's the cheery note that I'm starting with. And so that's going to lead me. I am going to talk about history. I'm going to talk about a bit of old history and then some much older history, and then try and bring it briefly up to date a bit. The history of cannabis is not particularly interesting in Australia. There was a bit of cannabis around. We used to smoke it in cigarettes about 1900. Cigars de joy, they were called. They were freely available. Laws changed a little bit, but there was no cannabis use in Australia through the 30s, when Australia kept receiving these reports from the US about weed of madness, and after every year they'd receive these reports from Harry Amenslinger and the Bureau of Tobacco and Firearms, talking about this stuff, and eventually they decided, geez, we better prohibit it because it sounds awful. And they were prohibiting something that really not only wasn't a problem, was hardly used in Australia. It didn't become used until the 60s. There's a lovely headline, I remembered as I drove here, from the Courier Mail in about 1937, 1938, which was weed of madness found growing wild on Queensland roads. And, I thought to myself, well, that explains it. But so it was prohibited, and then, of course, the market began, because after it was prohibited. And it was partly sort of the 60s drug and all of that sort of thing. So it's just part of the same pattern you see all around the world. Why was it prohibited in America? Well, that's to do with race, right? It's very much to do with the Mexicans. And the story was, that what it did was increase the sex drive of Mexicans, and that led them to assault white women all over the South. And so there was this moral panic built up about it. In the 70s and the 80s, we worried that the problem with marijuana was that it lowered your sex drive. So what we're seeing here is that and this is my basic take-home point, drug laws are not about drugs. They're about something else. And the clearest example of that in Australia is the prohibition of opium. And the prohibition of opium had nothing to do with opium. Only opium suitable for smoking was prohibited. Why? Because it was used by the Chinese. And it was part of the anti-Chinese xenophobia in Australia in the late 19th century. They prohibited specifically Chinese opium in the same way as now we might prohibit halal meat. Not because there's anything wrong with the meat, but because it's a nice thing to focus on as a kind of a scapegoat for a group of people that we feel uncomfortable or worried about for some other reason. But it also was tied in to an argument in which opium became a kind of a magical causative agent. Again, we see this over and over again, right? This magical causative agent. Why were white women sleeping with Chinese men? There were a lot of Chinese men in Australia in the 19th century. They mostly came here to work the gold fields. They stayed or they didn't stay. Their families were back in China. So there were a lot of single single Chinese men, and perhaps not surprisingly, there was a lot of sexual relationships across that line. And people became extremely agitated by them, and they wanted to stop it, and they couldn't understand why good white girls were having sex with Chinese men. Answer, the drugs made them do it. It's because of the drugs. They become the slave to the drugs, and if I had a PowerPoint, I'd show you the fantastic pictures of evil Chinese people. Mr. Sin was an evil Chinese drug agent seducing these poor innocent white girls. They're all blonde and they've got bare feet. That's the thing that makes you know that they're innocent. And and they get, you know, they get seduced into, and then they become slaves to the drug, and they'll do anything for the drug. It's a story again that gets repeated over and over again. So that again, we see how the fear is now the opposite, right? Then it was a fear that they might inbreed, right? There might be racial mixing. Now we worry that people won't mix, that they won't assimilate, that they won't. So and again, drugs are used to sort of stand for whatever it is that we need them to stand for, right? So they become used as these kind of symptoms. In each case, there is this anxiety, and the anxiety finds expression through the blaming of this object that allows us to punish people or to stop people and so on. And that happens over and over again. It's still happening. So the question is, and maybe this is a good question for a Council of Civil Liberties, does law always want to stop what it sets out to prohibit? Is that really what law is always about? We sort of assume that law says that something shouldn't exist, that they actually want it to be stamped out. But if we have some mad friend who keeps engaging in a certain kind of behaviour, and we keep telling them it doesn't make sense, it's harmful, they end up in jail or something like that, and they go on doing the same thing, at some point we stop thinking rationally and we say, what are they getting out of it? Why are they engaging in this irrational compulsive behaviour? Law also engages in irrational compulsive behaviour, such as prohibiting drugs like cannabis. And the question is, why does law do it? What does it get out of prohibition? And my argument is, if we understand drug laws as an expression of social anxiety, what laws want to do is not prohibit this activity, but perform it, stage it, make it into a spectacle, show it off, make it front and centre. It's a kind of theatre. Law is a kind of theatre to express and reassure us about these underlying anxieties, whatever they are. Again, you know, there's plenty of other examples that will help us make sense of what seems like irrational laws. Laws about terrorism, for example. You know, hard to think why people think that these laws will actually stop terrorism as opposed to just making more terrorism. But if the goal is to perform something, to stage it, to make it this spectacle that could be used to express this anxiety, then the laws make sense. Now, the other historical example I want to mention very briefly is, and this is going back a little bit now, witchcraft. Now, people do say, you know, drug laws are like witchcraft, but I actually think it's a more serious analogy than it's often given credit for. Witchcraft laws were actually the progenitor of drug laws, both because witches were associated with drugs back in the 16th and the 17th century, but also because before we had drug laws, with their reverse onus provisions and their willingness to prohibit possession and traces of possession, even if there's no real evidence of people using or behaving or trafficking or anything like that, the only laws that behaved like that were witchcraft laws, where, again, were reverse onus provisions and all of those things was called the primum acceptum. It was the unusual, the exception to the general principle of the rule of law. Now it's drug laws. In the 16th century, it was witchcraft laws. And because witchcraft was connected to ideas of addiction, women, you know, and this was, you know, the main thing that women were forced to confess in the 16th and the 17th century was having sex with the devil. And this horrible thing that women did, and then it turned out that they really liked it. They couldn't get enough of it. They became addicted to the devil. And they became possessed. So there's this connection between the possessed and the possession. Now, the point about all of this is witchcraft laws arise. For example, in England, there are no witchcraft laws in the early Middle Ages. Only in 1542, which, from a historian's point of view, is actually quite recent. The first witchcraft laws in England are in 1542. The witchcraft craze, which killed hundreds of thousands of women all over Europe, is in the 16th, the 14th, the 15th, the 16th and the 17th century. So there's this little window. Now, it's hard to believe that actually the number of women having sex with devils suddenly spiked in the 1600s. I don't think that's true. I think what spiked was the anxiety about witches and not the actual number of witches. Why did it spike in the 1500s? Hint, the Reformation. There are these huge social changes taking place. There are these huge crises over belief, over the proof of the existence of God. And the best book I've ever read on this, a really powerful book by a guy called Walter Stevens, called Demon Lovers, says, if you look at the texts of the transcripts of women who are interrogated and tortured and made to confess these things, and you think to yourself, how could clever people, because a lot of these prosecutors were clever people, seriously believe this nonsense? How could they actually believe this? And here says, they didn't fear witches. They hoped for them. They needed witches, because witches prove the physical existence of the devil. And it's the proof of the existence of this numinous world that can't be touched and felt and seen directly, that keeps the old order in place. They were desperate. It was the age of science. People were starting to believe in the empiricism. They were starting to be sceptical about claims about Eucharist's magical transfer of substances from one thing to another and so forth. We needed something. We needed something which would actually prove the existence of this world. And that's what the witches were, the physical existence through the physical sex that women had with the devil that they were made to confess. So witchcraft was... So once you just get that in your head, they didn't fear witches. They hoped for them. Then I think, for me, that completely changed how I was understanding that story and that kind of legal logic. You want something to appear. You want something to be visible. And that, I think, is exactly what happens and continues to happen with law in relation to drugs. It's an emotional thing. Law is about affect. It's about feeling. It's about very powerful feelings. You have to listen to politicians to see the idea that, men are rational is just completely insane. I don't know who came up with that idea. But so if we take that through to the present, well, I think we can see some of those same forces that people need this to be performed and become manifest. There are many distinctions we could draw between harm minimisation and zero tolerance. There's a whole taxonomy we could have. Most of you, I'm sure, are familiar in broad outline of the distinction. But one way to think of it is that what harm minimisation does is it blurs all lines. There's no separation between us and them, between the good drug and the bad drug, the good use and the bad use. Everything is about context, everything is relevant. We respond to try and help people get better in their lives. We don't respond by a blanket prohibition because a drug is evil. That language has no place in harm minimisation. It does have a place in zero tolerance, and we can do a little thought experiment and think, can we imagine harm minimisation for witches? I don't think so. I don't think we could imagine some scheme where we were going to have witches, they were allowed on broomsticks 2 days a week. Maybe they got plastic brooms rather than other brooms. Maybe they could have sex with, not demons, but maybe, mushrooms or something like that. Some sort of, replacement program. Could we imagine that? No, of course not. Because witchcraft was zero tolerance. And because the idea of zero tolerance is the distinction. It's not about whether people are helped or harmed or society is better or worse than that. It is about maintaining the distinction. And it's about maintaining the distinction for exactly the reasons that we've heard, I think, from Mick and from Keith, which is that the performance of drugs is about making the devil appear, staging this devil. And it relates to the idea of maintaining a line between individual autonomy and agency on the one hand, so that people are responsible for their actions, and if they do something stupid, they've got to pay the price, they've got to be punished, they've got to be locked up, and ignoring the social structure and the social problems that are actually the problem underneath. But if you don't want to look at those social problems and that social structure, then you need to find something like drugs or witches that you can use to explain the fact that the world is going to hell in a handbasket. So you maintain the stability of the system as it is. You refuse to look at those underlying problems of social justice. and you focus instead on something that you can prove to be evil, and you have to show people that it's evil, so you need a performance, right? And the performance with witchcraft was these confessions and tortures. Performance, as we know now, is things like drug busts and drug raids, right? And there's this whole show, right? This display of, as you say, pretty pointless exercises, pretty much a waste of police and customs energy and expertise, just to be before the cameras, just to be part of that show. And so it keeps a system where we don't look at those underlying social problems, where we don't respond to the causes, but only at the surface. It keeps it in place by this kind of performance. And funnily enough, that takes me back to the Chinese, because one of the things that happened in that whole story about opiums and Chinese was there was a royal commission into alleged Chinese immorality in New South Wales in 1893. And they got together about 15 of these women who were living lives in Chinatown, in Sydney, Dixon Street and so on. And they all came and they gave evidence to the Royal Commission. They were subpoenaed and they gave evidence. And they were all asked, you know, did the opium make you do it? Are you a slave to the drug? And they all said, don't be stupid. I never heard such nonsense, you know, except that probably, you know, rough old Australian accents. But they rejected it. Of course, the commissioners would keep asking the question because they were obsessed by this question. But they refused it. But the story that they told is really interesting. By and large, and I don't want to overgeneralise, but for many of these girls, I guess there were many of them young women. They had lovely old-fashioned names like May and Adelaide, and they told stories about being seduced by, you know, maybe a next-door neighbour in the country out west of New South Wales or something like that, or having a sexual relationship when before they were married. And then their families abandoned them, right? They disowned them. And what are they going to do? They moved to the city. They were looking at a life of prostitution. What else could they do? What other work could they do? They were stuck. And the Chinese men and the Chinese communities, by and large, they took these women in, and who knows how much, you know, was it a romantic relationship? Was it a purely pragmatic relationship? Was it a relationship of kindness? Those things would have varied. But you would say that the Chinese men and the Chinese community were treating these women better than the communities that they came from, that basically just hounded them out of these little towns and were done and dusted. There's the social problem that you don't want to see. There's the underlying social structure that you'd rather not face. So what you need is a scapegoat, a witch, that you can use to blame, to preserve the innocence of everybody. The innocence of these women because it's not their choice, it's the drugs making them doing. The innocence of the prosecutors and the police and the judges and the politicians because they're not punishing the woman, they're punishing the drug. We used to, in witchcraft, we call that exorcism, right? We're not hurting you, we might have to burn you to death, but it's actually just the devil that we're trying to get out of you. So all these people punishing, they're not actually punishing this person, they're only trying to save them by exercising this evil thing. And society is off the hook. The underlying questions are off the hook. The deep problems, the anxieties that are leading to this don't have to be faced. They can be repressed for another day or another year. So everybody is made safer by this rather neat structure of social control. Seems to me like that's why we keep having all of these reports, because we have to start thinking about how we're going to deal with the anxiety and the repression and the underlying problems, rather than just be responding in a rational way to an irrational response, to an anxiety response, which law happens to do particularly well. That's it.